Hi, today we're going to study how a floating dry dock works, and we'll also try to see how a ship is dry docked and undocked from a floating dry dock, and we'll also try to assess what are the advantages and disadvantages of a floating dry dock as compared to other forms of dry docking such as a grazing dock or a ship lift system. So here you can see some pictures of a floating dry dock. A floating dry dock is essentially a floating structure. You can see these two side wing walls, and there is a deck in between in which the vessels are dry docked, and below in the lower portion you will see a lot of what we call ballast tanks. I will try and explain to you how a dry docking operation in a floating dry dock is accomplished. So here you can see the profile and a side elevation of a floating dry dock, where you can see, the deck on which some dock blocks have been positioned and fixed. The side elevation also shows you several ballast tanks which are currently in an empty position. The dotted line that you see is essentially the two wing structures, which you can see in the side view, because in the section view, because in the side view I'm trying to show a side elevation section, which is a section cut at the middle of the dry dock, so you don't see the two wings in the elevation, but you can see the two wings in the transfer section. In the transfer section, again you can see that there is a deck here, and in addition there are the side elevation. The wings have got certain two structures. The deck, below the deck you find ballast tanks, and there are some buoyancy tanks which are typically fitted on both the wing structures. So this is how, roughly a floating dry dock can be described. So the ballast tanks are essentially used for reducing the increasing and reducing the draft of the floating dry dock to facilitate the dry docking operation. This is typically accomplished by using very special pumps which are installed on the ballast tank. The side wings also contain the control stations from which the floating dry docks are operated. So now let us see how a vessel can be dry docked in a floating dry dock. So here you can see the side elevation which we just showed you, a floating dry dock with all its ballast tanks and the dock blocks which are fixed on the deck of the floating dry dock. On the right you see a vessel which is to be dry docked in the floating dry dock. Now you will notice something very uncanny here. The floating dry dock is fundamentally designed to float at a very low draft. There is a lot of buoyancy in its empty condition. So therefore, the weight is very less, and therefore it floats with a very low draft. And there is a lot of the empty tanks in the empty ballast tanks and the empty buoyancy tanks in the side wings. They provide a lot of buoyancy, which makes the structure float at a very low draft. In comparison, if you see a ship, the draft, even when the ship is completely empty, even when the cargo is not there, the draft of the vessel is significantly high and significantly higher than the draft of the floating dry dock. For example, if you take a VLCC, which is a very large crude carrier, which is a 330-meter vessel, and its draft in full load condition is somewhere close to 22-24 meters. Even in an empty condition, uh, and typically a vessel is dry docked or undocked or built in an empty condition. Even in an empty condition, the draft of a very large crude carrier is roughly about 10 to 12 meters. So obviously, in this existing condition, this vessel can't be docked into the floating dry dock. So we have to, now I'll explain to you how this is accomplished. So what happens is, the ballast tanks in the floating dry dock are gradually filled in a controlled manner. So when you start filling the ballast tanks with seawater, the floating dry dock becomes heavier and it starts sinking, but the sinking is a very, very controlled sinking. In a very, very systematic manner, the sinking is accomplished. So as you keep filling the ballast tank with water slowly, the floating dry dock keeps sinking and sinking and sinking in a controlled manner, and you keep doing this there is until the draft of the floating dry dock becomes significantly higher than the draft of the vessel which is supposed to be docked in the floating dry dock. So what how is this accomplished is by this controlled mechanism, where you are flooding and filling the ballast tanks in a controlled manner. Now, one important aspect that you need to understand is how much should this draft be? The draft should be so much that when the vessel passes over the floating dry dock into the floating dry dock, there is sufficient clearance between the bottom of the vessel and the top of the dock blocks in which it is supposed to be sitting. Now, these dock blocks are specially designed for each ship. They have to be made. They typically, some of the dock blocks are flat, some of the dock blocks are curved and shaped exactly in the same manner in which the bottom of a vessel is shaped. So, the dock blocks are custom made for the vessel and they take the shape of the vessel. And when you are bringing the vessel, there must be sufficient clearance between the bottom of the vessel and the top of the dock block so that the dock blocks don't get disturbed or don't get hit by the vessel when they're coming inside. So we will see that in the next. So when you see this here, you can see that the ship is coming, but there is sufficient clearance between the bottom of the vessel and the top of the dock blocks. And the of course the you must also remember that floating dry dock is operated in calm waters in a deep port or a deep harbor area, and it is typically moored and held in a stationary position using these mooring arrangements. So the vessel is also brought in a controlled manner, and there is sufficient clearance between the bottom of the vessel and the top of the dock blocks. And once the vessel is accurately positioned exactly where it is supposed to sit down, then the docking operation continues. So here what happens is all the ballast tanks which have been filled are now using pumps gradually emptied. So when you empty the ballast tanks, the floating dry dock becomes lighter. See, when you empty the ballast tanks, the floating dry dock becomes lighter and it starts rising. So as you start rising, what happens is at some point of time it keeps rising and rising. At some point of time, the dock blocks touch the vessel, and the vessel's weight is borne by the dock blocks. So the vessel starts resting on the dock blocks, and the vessel along with the dock blocks and the FDD are now continuing to rise because of the gain in buoyancy which is being accrued on account of the water being pumped out of the ballast tanks, and the ballast tanks are essentially having air and are empty and therefore are providing buoyancy. So you continue doing this and you continue emptying the tanks, and the FDD along with the ship keeps lifting until until the ship and the deck of the pontoon become deck of the floating dry dock become clear of the water surface, and all the water is automatically drained off the deck of the floating dry dock. So now what you can see here is, you can clearly see that with the ship in its with the ship dry dock and it's lifted, the underwater portion of the ship is completely exposed. Therefore, any kind of repair or maintenance activities on the underwater structure or on the underwater appendages like the rudder, propeller, etc., can be undertaken by accessing the underwater portion on through the top of the floating dry dock deck. So how is the undocking operation accomplished? So undocking operation accomplished is exactly the opposite, where what you essentially do is you are going to start filling the ballast tanks of the pontoon slowly, which means the pontoon along with the ship now starts sinking, and this continues to sink in a controlled manner, and you keep on filling as the draft keeps on increasing. At some point of time, the total draft of the vessel, total draft of the floating dry dock is sufficiently high that the ship starts floating, which means essentially the the total draft is more than the draft of the ship plus the depth of the pontoon along with the dock block. So therefore, the pontoon continues to sink, but since the draft of the ship has been reached, the ship doesn't sink anymore. The ship is free and ship starts floating freely. So as the ship starts floating freely, it becomes clear of the dock block and there is sufficient clearance. So when there is sufficient clearance between the dock block, the pumping out operation is stopped. So the floating dry dock is stationary in an immersed condition with sufficient clearance between the bottom of the ship and the top of the dock block. And now the ship can be safely moved out of the floating dry dock into a safe position. And once this is done, once again the tanks are all emptied, and once again the floating dry dock will come back to float back to the surface. So this is how, in short, we can describe how a floating dry dock operates. Now, what are the advantages? The advantages of floating dry dock is movable. You can move it, you can locate it in any place. Today you are operating in one place, tomorrow you can tow it to another place and operate the same thing. It is relatively less expensive as compared to the graving dry docks, the ship lift systems, and it takes much lesser time to build. It is suitable for small and medium sized vessels, and it's very very suitable for ship repair operations which are requiring short turnaround time between vessels. It's very very suitable for those kind of operations. If you look at the disadvantages, it has got certain limitations for dry docking very large vessels. That is, even if you are able to build a floating dry dock which is significantly large enough, the operations can only be undertaken in places which not only have calm water, but there is also sufficient depth, which means it is possible only in deep water ports and harbors, which means from a dry dock, the depth, suppose the draft of a vessel is say 12 meters. When you undock it from a dry dock, you need only about 40 meters of water depth. But for operating a floating dry dock, if you want to build or dry dock a vessel which has got a 12-meter draft, then you need the floating dry dock to sink to significant depth, which is about 18 meters, which means you need 20 meters or more of water depth for operating the same, for dry docking the same vessel as compared to a dry dock. So therefore, it is not very suitable for very large vessels because it demands very high water depth as compared to other operations. So there are limitations for new vessel construction owing to the weight distribution. Typically in a dry dock, you can build it in sections, in different sections. But in a floating dry dock, because it is a floating structure, if you asymmetrically load the structure, then it becomes unbalanced, and only some of it can be controlled by using some ballast control operations and weight distribution operations. It's not a very very flexible option as compared to a graving dry dock which is on solid land. Unlike graving dry docks, it also cannot be partitioned. A graving dry dock can be portioned or partitioned into two halves with an intermediate caisson gate or intermediate partition, and the two halves of the graving dock can be operated independently, which means you can build or dry dock two vessels independent of each other, and the one on the front may have a shorter time and can be undocked, and the other one may require a longer time and can continue to operate. But you can't do this sort of a partitioning in a floating dry dock. So, and also in the case of ship lifts, offer you the advantage of once the ship is lifted and brought to land using the ship lift rail system, they can be moved sideways using the transverse motion mechanism to other berths. So which means from a ship lift you can effectively have 4 or 5 side berths, which means 4 or 5 vessels can be simultaneously dry docked using one ship lift. Such a thing, however, is not possible in a floating dry dock. So this in brief explains to you how a floating dry dock operates.